but there are many times where I wish I could travel back through time and grab my younger self and say, not only will you not date, there are some lessons about game development that you should be aware of. And so I put together a whole series of lessons of stuff that I've learned over the years. I'm going to guess that just by going to this school, you guys might know half of them. You might know more than that. If you know all of them, I want you to come talk to me because I'm like, how did you figure it out so quickly? Because I sure didn't. Anyway, so I'm Chris Avellone, computer game designer. I got my degree in English, of all things, which is the most worthless degree to make a living at. You can be either a teacher or a lawyer, neither of which I'm qualified to do. But I discovered that when I was in college, I spent most of my time just designing computer games that were all terrible. But it's what I really, really loved to do. And I kept submitting these ideas to game companies until they got sick of me. Until one company out in California, Interplay, gave me a chance. They're like, you know what? We desperately need a junior designer to work at our company in our D&D division. I'm like, that sounds great because California is frickin' beautiful. I will absolutely go there. I might potentially get drunk at all your holiday parties. That's also fantastic. But most of all, it gave me a chance to do what I love, which is to design and develop computer games. And it's what I love to do. I've worked on way too many titles. I'm probably going to work on way too many more titles before the end of things. But I got to work on Planetscape Torment, Star Wars, espionage role-playing games. I had the huge pleasure to work on some of the games in the Fallout series, including Fallout New Vegas, a lot of the cool DLC content, which was a lot of fun to do. We got the crazy opportunity to work on a South Park game, which I thought would never be possible. It's totally crazy. I met one of the designers for FTL a long time ago, and I convinced him that, please let me write for your product for free. That's how much I love your game. And he's like, well, we'll see. And then 1 week later, I also got to work on a number of Kickstarter projects, including In Exile's Wasteland 2. And I'm currently working on the spiritual successor to Torment, Tides of Numenera. Whew. And also, I spend my time trying to educate others about all the mistakes that I've made. And this presentation is going to be a little bit random, so please bear with me. So one of the first things that I wish I could go back and talk to my younger self about is I agonized a great deal over what to study in college. I actually had no idea what to do to sort of follow my passions. And I wish that I had just relaxed a little bit and recognized that it was all the stuff that I was doing in my spare time that was actually composing my education. And you guys are way luckier than I was because there are so many tool sets and engines out there that you can use nowadays to develop game design content. The options are just all out there. And when you're working at a studio, to actually see a game developer that's willing to spend their free time to do something, say, like overhaul Oblivion, they just felt like doing that in their spare time. We pay attention to stuff like that in game studios. We actually pay attention to mods out there, and we usually know who the best mod developers are. One particular example I'll give you is we got a resume from a very talented world builder named Jorge Salgado, who goes by the name Oscuro. And he spent an entire year deciding that Oblivion was just not good enough for him. So in all his spare time, he completely rewrote the world. He put it up on the net for player review, and it got a 9.9 player review score. Do you know how hard that is? You guys play games, you know how hard that is. You guys are a finicky bunch. And then there was over 100,000 downloads for it. He did 3 iterations of the patch. He included all the patch notes. He fixed all the bugs. And this means that when he actually applied to us, not only did we know who he was, he'd already been through the entire process of game development, and we knew that he just loved doing it, period, that he was willing to do it in his free time. And that's what we look for at a game studio. We do, of course, pay him, and he's a good guy, but he showed us things about the engine we didn't even know about because he trained himself. So anyway, school helps, but there's other ways to get your education out there. One that worked out pretty well for me through many, many mistakes is I used to be a pen and paper game master, which is one of the worst jobs in the world. But when none of your players will actually run any games for you, you're really left with no choice but to run games yourself in order to entertain yourself. And it's actually one of the best training methodologies for game design I ever had, mostly because you get a wide range of players. You get to see their immediate feedback for whether you are actually entertaining them or not, and that can be a pretty tough road to follow. And sometimes you get to see what actually excites them about a particular adventure that you're doing that you may not even realize until the moment actually happens. One other thing that I wish I could sort of go back and tell myself about is it's really important to be able to sell what's fun about your game idea to people that can't immediately play it or can't immediately see it. And we usually call this the hook of whatever design element you're including. It might be the design element of the entire game. So for example, one particular hook might be, hey, we're going to do a game that's like BioShock, but it's going to have dinosaurs instead. That's a simple one sentence where anyone in the studio can realize, okay, I see what the camera view is going to be like. I know what type it's going to be, a shooter's type game, but here's how it's setting itself apart. So having that sort of one sentence hook for both the developers you're working with and your audience is really, really important. Because I'll tell you, when you get way too many proposals about the latest dark, gritty sci-fi shooter, you really just want to blow your brains out because it is an exhausting process to see the same cliche again and again and again. Sometimes I get the question, like, where do the ideas come from? And how do you prevent designer block? Because sometimes you'll be sitting in front of the screen, I'm sure you've all been in this situation where it gets near the 10th hour or the 11th hour and no amount of staring at the screen is actually going to help you get past the designer's block that hits you. And over the years, there were a few methodologies I used to actually fight designer's block. One is the amazing power of caffeine. That'll keep you going, but only for so long. One of my friends actually suggested that sometimes it's better to go out and get entertained yourself. And one of the best ways he suggested was, hey, go see a live performance in the theater. Having all those actors on stage sort of emoting at you can make a nice sort of creative atmosphere to get your ideas flowing. And if you happen to go see that play on caffeine, that's even better. Also, this is something that I did get out of my college experience. One of my professors always suggested that when you sort of hit that designer block or that writer's block, it's always good to sort of go outside your comfort zone. See a movie you wouldn't normally see, like page through a magazine that normally you would avoid like the plague. Or you can actually do something cool, like just go explore some interesting history books from cultures that you're not familiar with, because we discovered that in the grand history of the human race, there are so many crazy stories that are far better than any fiction or science fiction you can read. It is a fascinating place out there. One thing, another piece of advice I got is pressure always helps. So if you can join a developer jam or a writing group, having 4 or 5 people sitting around you constantly producing in a high energy atmosphere can pretty much break you out of any writer's block or designer's block because you feel like you have to produce to keep up with them. Another method I discovered just searching online is that there's a website called Write or Die. And the way it's set up is you can enter a field for like, hey, I'd like to write for 20 minutes. I'd sort of like to hit a target goal of 500 words or 1,000 words. And this could be anything. It'd be like a design document, a short piece of fiction, whatever you're trying to get out of your head. The trick is that blank text window will stare at you. And if you don't do anything with it, it'll start to flash. And, that's the first warning. And you might motivate yourself to write a few lines, but if you pause again, then the program starts deleting all your text. And that ends up being a good pressure moment because you're trying to hold on to every single word. You'd be amazing how many inventory item descriptions I got through just using Write or Die. It's a fantastic method. Also, I like to work out when I can, although I'm not really doing that too much nowadays. But I found that's a nice way to sort of break the mode of game development, especially if you have a workout routine set up that allows you to do research or play video games while you're working out. And other speakers have said this earlier today, but maintaining your health in game development, I really can't recommend it strongly enough. And there's ways to actually play games, do your research while doing aerobic exercise, and I highly recommend those, and especially if you want to get through several seasons of Battlestar Galactica. And hypothetically, you might want to just keep rowing and rowing and rowing until you get to the end of the season, which really helps you generate these fun things called endorphins, which are also ways of breaking designer's block. One method I learned in college was to attend the most boring classes ever and keep a sketchbook nearby, because I would do anything to try to escape the teacher who was talking to me. And when you have your sketchbook and you're doing things like drawing maps or writing NPC character descriptions or quests, it looks like you're taking notes. And the teacher's like, well, that student's really paying attention right now. He seems really involved in what I'm saying. Not at all. It's just a way of escaping what's going on around you. Sometimes my email inbox gets filled with people who have the best idea for a game ever. And I have to keep finding new and polite ways to say that basically doesn't matter. No one really cares. Mostly because if you send those to a game developer studio, they're filled with people just like you, where they've already got tons of game ideas. What they're focused on is how to make those ideas great. And there's a few examples that I like to use. If someone came to me and said that, I've got an idea for a superhero that dresses up like a bat, fights crime, and his arch enemy is a psychotic clown, I would probably think that's a pretty shitty idea. But with the right hands, you might actually create one of the best superhero characters ever. And it's all in the execution. So if you've got an idea for a plumber protagonist, show me what you can do with that. I'm interested in the execution of your idea. If you think a beach ball style game is fun, prove it to me. I'm sure you can do it, but I want to see your execution, not hear about what great idea that you have. This is pretty obvious. Play a lot of games, both in your genre that you're interested in and ones that are outside your genre. There's pretty simple reasons for that. You want to be familiar with the entire range and scope of games that you're interested in making. But when it comes to things outside your genre, plenty of games have already solved whatever design problem you might have in the future. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel if some other game has already figured out a very elegant solution for how to solve the problem that you're struggling with. I also suggest playing bad games. Not only for the passion that they inspire, but it forces designers to examine why that game is bad. And you should absolutely do postmortems on every game that you play and make notations for where they dropped the ball. Because there could have been a good idea in there, but they weren't able to hit that bar where it was actually entertaining. And once you have all those notes, use those to sort of create your formulas, your theories for how it could have been improved. If you apply them to your own games, you'll have those solutions already worked out. And those become part of your design doc for your next title. Although, to be fair, don't ever make a design doc this size because no one will ever read it. Also, equally importantly, is you want to watch other people play games too, because you are not the sole audience and developer for this game. You want to see how other people play games both in that genre and play your own game to see what's entertaining about it to them, and that's also very important. We have this thing called the fun test that we use with developers, where we'd ask them their opinions on various titles, and it mattered to us very much how they reacted when we asked them what they thought about a certain game. If they just simply said, you know what, it's fun, I had a good time with it, that generally did not go over very well. But when we asked other potential developers, hey, what do you think of this title? And then they were able to break down exactly things like, the leveling scheme was paced the right way. The bazooka mechanics felt correct. The formulas that they had for the spells, I never felt like I was running dry of spells. It was a good challenge moment. Also, the jumping mechanics were also really good. And they can go on, but they're actually able to boil down what was fun about that game into very concrete facts. And I do believe that very much, that you can do that with a lot of fun elements. Furthermore, really good game designers make fun from essentially unfun material. So for example, supposing you have a scenario where there's some crazy monster rampaging after the players, completely invulnerable, they can't do anything about it except run. chances are that's probably not a very fun situation for players. But a good game developer will examine that situation and find a way to turn it on its head and essentially fix that scenario so that it's much more entertaining for the players. And a good example of this is if any of you have played Arkham Asylum or Arkham City, there are these horrible things called Titans that will show up. Basically, these huge rampaging monsters take a lot of damage, but the moment that Batman wears them down, he can hop on their back and then use their fists against all the enemies in the area, which is like a hugely satisfying moment. And that's a good example of good game design. Also, I encourage people to absorb everything they can, but not just from games. Do your research, read interesting history, research classic movies, find ways to draw inspirations from themes they use. There's a lot of good material out there, even from potentially really bad movies when you examine them enough. But do your research, but don't limit it just to games. Continually recycling the same game ideas without other outside inputs being brought into it can kind of be an empty road. You want to broaden your horizons when you can. But the nice thing is, you're probably going to be having a lot more fun doing research than just about anyone else going to school. In fact, I think that most of my research inadvertently happened while I was goofing off, which probably didn't make my mother too happy. But whether you're watching Star Wars and sort of indulging in the James Bond series of movies, fighting off aliens, watching any of a variety of Hong Kong action movies, which, by the way, if you're doing a fighting game, watch as many as you can because the crazy maneuvers in those movies, I am in awe. But chances are you're probably already going to work with a lot of these franchises over the course of your career, whether you realize it or not. So know your vampires, know your zombie culture. And chances are even watching countless seasons of South Park might eventually benefit you in the future should you happen to get that game as a franchise. So yeah, do your research. Chances are there's a lot of popular culture, sci-fi, and fantasy stuff out there that it's just good for you to be familiar with, as long as you respect the medium that you're actually creating for. The example that I have for this is the Watchmen movie was based on the Alan Moore graphic novel of same name. And Watchmen was pretty revolutionary for its time, which was way back in the 80s, which was about my teenage years. But one nice thing about the way Watchmen was set up is it subverted a lot of superhero tropes. Things that had gotten very cliche about the superhero culture, Alan Moore sort of turned those on their head. But the interesting thing is when you compare it to turning that into a feature film, there's certain elements about the graphic novel that just don't translate as well into a movie. So for example, in the intro to Watchmen, there's a very long sequence where Rorschach's journal, he's going on about crime in the city and how filthy it is, et cetera, which actually works really well in the comic book. But when you watch the Watchmen movie, it really bogs down the beginning of it just because there's so much being said that was actually never meant to be said in the first place. So on one hand, you can say, hey, I'm respecting the franchise by implementing the graphic novel verbatim. But when you're switching from movies to graphic novels to games, just be aware of what the medium constraints are. If you have to have an opening narration or a narration at all, look for other ways to do it that complement the medium. And for example, Bastion was really good about this. It actually had an interactive narration that took place over the course of the game that never slowed down the action. It was responding to your actions as a character, and that's a fantastic way to do narration for a video game. So essentially, let the medium do its thing. There's ways like a book can convey a certain theme, and ways movies can convey certain themes, and the same thing is true for games as well. So speaking of Blade Runner is one of the movies that I point to about the importance of giving flaws to all your characters. In the movie, there is an antagonist, Roy Batty. He is basically a super android. There is very little that Roy Batty cannot do. He is basically Captain America on steroids. He can punch through walls, leap tall buildings. He can do the whole thing. But you know what, even better yet, he has the brain of Tony Stark. So not only is he this guy who can punch through walls, he's also a super genius. In my opinion, that would make him a really boring character. I'm like, wow, there's really not much that he can't do. But the nice spin on it is they give him the flaw that old Roy is only 4 years old and his life is rapidly running out. And what's worse is that 4-year lifespan means he doesn't have the context to deal with the fact that his death is imminent. And that emotional immaturity basically gives him the motivation throughout the movie for why he's doing all these things and makes him a far more interesting character. And Blade Runner is sort of an example where I feel like movies and graphic novels have figured out things that games haven't, and that's another reason to do your research. So back to Watchmen, for example. The Watchmen came at a point where there was so much about superheroes that had been done to death for countless years, and this was a moment where so many stories had been told that they'd gotten so used to that cliche that they attacked that cliche. And I think movies hadn't quite hit that point yet, especially with a lot of the Marvel movies that are coming out. But look for ways where graphic novels, books can sort of help you bring new ideas and new perspectives to the game genre. So next thing, I got this little tidbit from watching way too much Doctor Who, which if you don't watch it, I really encourage you to. It's a fantastic show. Doctor Who does this amazing thing where they bombard you in the first 5 minutes of almost every episode with a bunch of questions that you have to know the answers to because they're so crazy. And I think that's a perfect way to start a game. If you present the characters with a bunch of questions that are very compelling and they want to know the answer to them, that does a great job of luring the player in, as long as you make a compact to the player that you're going to answer all those questions by the end of the game. This is something my family is not so great about, but my brother is great about. Often they make the best focus testers because they're so used to you that they'll give you very, very honest feedback. And PopCap's really good about this. They have a methodology where not only they get their family and friends to play the game and offer feedback, they sort of have the grandmother test, where if they set their grandmother down in front of a certain game and she just keeps playing it, they probably have a very accessible hit on their hands. But what I like about family and friends is that feedback, especially from my brother, if he doesn't like something, that actually is more than fine with me because I'd rather hear it from him than say, oh, I don't know, 10,000 people once the game is actually released. So getting that feedback early, having a lot of focus tests is really important to prevent your ego from getting beaten up on the forums or just about anywhere else. And because people can talk a lot of trash about your game. So getting that early feedback is good. Speaking of talking trash, when you are in game development, do not talk trash about anybody else. Like anybody else in game development, you can offer critiques about their performance, you can make insightful commentary with no profanity about their games, but game development's a very, very small world. And if you end up being that person that talks a lot of shit about everybody else, we will know. We're like, that's not the kind of poison that we want in our studio. Games are a very collaborative effort. Everybody has to work together and try and keep things positive, try and be supportive because the yelling back and forth is just not going to get anything constructive done. Hopefully, however, you guys will be able to land at a studio where critiques are welcome. And what I mean by critiques are, hypothetically, a talking trash example would be, Chris, all the doors in Alpha Protocol are fucked. Like, I fucking hate this game. It's frustrating to play. And I'm like, oh my God, like what's wrong? When a critique could be given as, hey Chris, in most games like this, the A button is a context-sensitive action. And when applied to doors, like it commonly is in most games, that allows me to get familiar with the interface a lot faster rather than the strange key that you've mapped the opening door to because there are a lot of doors in your game. That is a very valid critique, and I am very willing to listen to that and iterate accordingly. But please, just phrase them as critiques. I have an intense hatred of minigames, but I recognize that they're necessary, and that was a very hard thing for me to struggle with for quite some time. Every game sort of has a feedback loop associated with it. But being able to break out of that loop sort of gives your brain a chance to recharge. So even for an RPG game where you're going through killing monsters, getting loot, there's sort of like mini games that are already hidden in that formula for like inventory management or buying and selling stuff from traders to get the most profit. Those things are actually mini games that sort of give the main feedback loop a rest from the player's brain and sort of allow them to sort of like take a break for a moment, do something else, let their brain shift gears, and then jump back to the main feedback loop and make them appreciate it more. One of the big questions that I try and ask after reading any design, including my own, is why would I care about this design as a player? Like, why would any player want to engage in this mechanic? And one of the prime examples I use is sometimes designers get very intense about lore for the game. And they might do lore books. They might do a lot of lore books. But at that point, I sort of ask them to take a step back and go, well, the lore about this faction may not be as compelling to a player as, say, an organization that you can join. And they give you quests. Maybe you get cool armor from them. Maybe they give you cool special abilities. Or even better for players, maybe there's a way where they can become the leader of that faction. That's much more empowering for a player. And we try and ask, why should the player care about this design element you do? And if you don't have a good reason for it, then it just needs to be re-examined. Designers need to balance challenge versus frustration. And don't get me wrong, like part of a designer's job is to create a lot of hoops for the player to jump through. The question is, how do you make that entertaining at the end of the day? And one struggle I've always had is, as a game master, I very much believe in time limits. I think time limits do an amazing job of making every player in a game or at the gaming table suddenly sit up and take notice and go, oh my God, if we don't do this in 30 minutes, we're all in serious trouble or we're going to die. That is a really bad thing to do in computer games. But I can't deny the fact that time limits as a game master, they actually do work for motivating players. So the question in that case becomes, how do you introduce this challenge that's usually unacceptable to players, but still create that sense of urgency that motivates them to move forward? And one of the best examples I have for this is I tend to cite System Shock 2 a lot. If you guys haven't played it, I really highly recommend it. It's a fantastic game. They did a nice aspect where they actually balanced challenge versus frustration, that title, by not attaching a time limit to the player. They attached a time limit to the actual implants that power up the player. So if you get a strength implant or an agility implant, it would have a little internal battery that you could watch the little counter go down until you went back to a power generator, recharged it, and suddenly that implant was powered back up. Those implants were very important to your survival, but having that time limit run out actually wouldn't end the game for you, and the player had more control over resetting those time limits. But the urgency was still there while you were exploring the world of System Shock 2, which was a really nice way to balance challenge versus frustration. I'm sure you guys hear show, don't tell a lot. That's pretty much standard for computer games, but it also applies to people in your studio too, and also people that are gonna be working with your studio. It is not the best thing in the world for a voice actor or an artist to get any sort of document like this. It's just too much text. It's not actually getting to the point of what that character is. And usually voice actors don't have time to read this stuff anyway. It's much better if you can actually boil down a character to the bullet points, include a lot of reference images for how you think that character should feel in the game, and then let the artist go do their thing. You're like, you know what? I've hired you to this particular job of being a concept artist. Here's the design stuff that I need from this character. Here's some thoughts I had about it, but please just show me what you can do with the concepts. Some developers I know are very shy about their forums, and you absolutely can't be. You have to face the bile that is on there if there is any, and also embrace the positives that are on there as well. If there are people on your forums that are getting really upset about some aspect of your game, it's always important to try and drill down and figure out what they're really upset about. Somewhere in that trash talking is probably a very valid critique for why they got upset in the first place. And it's absolutely worth engaging with them and asking them questions about the experience to try and figure out how you can resolve it. Because at the end of the day, your game is your only defense. The game has to speak for itself. Once it's released, there's very little that you can do to patch a major problem like that. So if you've designed system mechanics that aren't fun, if you create unfun situations, you will probably never have a full chance to defend yourself and without getting some level of feedback like that. A few last points. I sometimes struggle with the idea that innovation has to be tied to the latest console or new PC upgrade that comes out. Some of the best innovation that I've seen in games has actually been very low-tech innovation, and particularly with RPGs. For example, Fallout did a really amazing thing when the first game was released, where the designers decided that, hey, why don't we make a dialogue system that checks your stats and your abilities? And for example, if your intelligence is really high, you get these super smart responses. But if your intelligence is less than 4, then you get really stupid responses. And that didn't require a whole lot of brand new technology to create. It just required you to check a variable and then just change the text. But in terms of the role-playing experience, it created an amazing change for how you played the game based on the stats that you chose at the beginning of the game. And I thought that was fantastic. Also, if you guys ever have the joy, like I do, of being part of a canceled title, it's just going to happen. Like, actually, if you haven't had it happen yet, it's probably coming somewhere down the pipe. Don't stress out about it. Don't worry about it. It just happens. The important thing to do is when that happens, just take all those design elements that you were doing for the title, put them in your backpack, and save them for something down the road. The franchise may change, the context may change, but you still have those systems and those designs that you can draw upon to actually to keep using in the future. Just don't abandon them. This one was particularly hard for me to deal with as a narrative designer. It was to let go and let systems in the game do their thing. And the example that I try and use with this is in Fallout New Vegas, there's 2 factions, the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion. These 2 factions, they don't like each other, but also they have a feeling about the player based on a reputation system in the game. And the reputation system works pretty much standard for role-playing games, where if you piss off a faction to a certain amount, they're going to send hit squads after you, which we thought was a pretty simple mechanic. Until one day, one of the developers who was doing a completely crazy playthrough, he decided he was going to piss off Caesar's Legion, decided he was going to piss off the New California Republic. They sent hit squads after him, so he woke up in the Mojave from like his rest mechanic and discovered that there were 2 hit squads waiting for him. But the joy of it was they didn't attack him. What they did is they tore into each other, and suddenly there were like 40 corpses like all over the Mojave, and he's just sitting there watching this, and he's telling us about it, and we're like, it would have taken a narrative designer probably 3 months to craft a cutscene that had that same emotional appeal, all the quest lines leading up to it. But because we had the systems that let that story play out, that actually ended up being a much better story for the player than anything we could have written. The last thing is, and I'm sure you guys already know this, but there is a job out there for you. If you love what you're doing enough and you're persistent at it and you're willing to endure, say, on my end, like 30 different rejections from various publishers saying, please don't send us any more submissions again, just keep being persistent, because eventually someone is going to need your help. And I've seen it happen again and again and again. Wait for your battlefield promotion, because if you love what you do, trust me, as long as you don't give up on it, there's a place for you in the game industry. So that is my long list of a stream of consciousness. If you guys have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Okay, so you worked on after you released the team that you Planetscape Torment. Do you have anything that you say from? Sorry, so you have actually led the team that developed Planetscape Torment. Right.
Yes.
Do you have anything that you saved from there, let's say, to Tides of Numenera? Because you're talking about mechanics or things that you save maybe that you had to give up back then. And
Well, that was a little bit different because actually I feel like everything we did actually made it into the game, which was really weird. That's kind of rare.
Amazing.
I think the only things that would have been missing is we probably would have liked to have added more locations and a little bit more focus on some combat mechanics. But what was interesting was all the themes that were present in the game. That's what caused all the support for the Kickstarter for people that specifically wanted to see those things. So I feel like the first Torment was kind of like an editing job where suddenly you're like, well, I guess only players who really, really like this will support the successor. So I feel like they now know what they're getting into. But you should see a lot of the same methodology in Tides of Numenera.
one more question about the narrative from Planetscape Torment. I mean, we all know it's, for us at least, is one of those things that we look up there wherever we think about creating a story.
You are very kind.
I was thinking, how much did you actually had to iterate for that particular story?
So not very much. Here's what the strange thing was with that game. It's actually, they left me alone for a year, which is always a mistake. And so I actually did a first pass of the entire story, a lot of the major characters. So when it came time for a full production team to come on, we were actually able to give like area design packets to everybody and go, here's some major quests, here's some major NPCs. You don't have to stick with these. And although there's going to be certain key story points we're going to want you to hit, just base it off of that if you wish. And a lot of the guys did use a lot of those characters that were in the area packets, but then they also added more additional material that they felt more excited about. So there was some wiggle room there where they were able to add more to the story to flesh out certain wards and planes and things like that.
Thank you.
Sure. Up front.
Yes, you spoke a little bit about artist block and writings block. If you have the luxury problem to have what we might call artist flood, what would you consider too many projects? And how would you decide which projects to continue on your spare time?
Are you talking like if you have 4 or 5 different things that you're working?
Or 14.
Or 14. Are you serious? Wow.
Yeah, like comics, like
okay,
role plays.
you need to slow down,
Yeah,
first
I
off. Wow. Okay. All right. So, wow. So I'm working about 7 different things right now. But I don't know how consistent your work is from project to project. Like, I don't know if you're always doing character concepts, for example, for every single game. But what I found is, for the current projects I'm working on, every project requires something a little bit different. And sometimes, like, it might be editing or doing more technical design for, like, here's how to spec out an area or do the production plan. I found that I work better on those towards the end of the day when my brain's all dead because they require less creativity, but I still feel like I'm being productive. For other projects, sometimes I choose a certain day where I'm only going to work on like 2 or 3 and then leave the rest down the road and just don't think about them for a while and give them, especially if they need a little bit of time to cook. But I've also found that one of the best things to do is start working as soon as you wake up in the morning. Don't check email, don't look at your phone, grab your sketchbook, get on the computer, make sure the internet's yanked out, and then just do what you need to do until you just can't work anymore. I've usually found that with writing, I can sometimes get like an hour or 2 hours in before the email jitters start. I'm like, oh, there's probably some problem waiting in my inbox right now, but at least I got something done before all the emergencies hit. So it's a matter of timing and recognizing like how you work. And I definitely feel free to experiment in terms, because I actually didn't know for a while that waking up early in the morning would help with writing until I couldn't sleep for about an hour, and then I woke up and then I'm like, wow, I think I'll just start writing because this is worrying me so much. And suddenly like, wow, I got a lot done. But then I saw my email and then I got sad again, so it's all right.
So you mentioned like stacking perhaps 2 factions against each other as a way to make the game systems tell the story. Do you have any other examples of game mechanics or game systems that might help you tell a story that's not really scripted? Or
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, but the stories aren't really intentional, but they're still funny. One is Whew. So on Skyrim, they made a great decision, right? And I do mean this. That on first glance, it seems like it's perfect. What they do is, in terms of like spotting if you're stealing from something, they decided, hey, we'll trace a line from the character's eyes. Who's laughing? Because you know where I'm going with this, right? Where they're like, hey, if they actually see you doing it, that's what causes the trouble. However, there's a lot of props in Skyrim. So like people would just take buckets and put them on the guards' heads, block their line of sight, and then rob the place, which I thought was the best thing in the world. Now, that wasn't obviously an intentional mechanic, but that would be an example of like how systems can sort of tell their own stories without whether you mean them to or not, as long as they're not too game breaking. But man, there were a lot of guards with bucket heads at the end of a playthrough. It was really good. But the worst part is, I think if they'd added a mechanic that's like, well, maybe we can use the AI to have them take the buckets off their heads. I guarantee that would have created like 3 more stories about how that caused more issues. So I don't know, but.
All right, so
Oh, my old enemy.
yes.
How are you?
We can fight later.
Excellent.
I recently played Pillars, and there is a tower in the central town that has a really interesting storyline. And I got really curious when I played through, because there are plenty of notes and diary entries, but they seem to be a bit conflicting, or they tell different parts of the same story.
Is this a tower with the guy that's slowly dying at the top of the track? Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like you have, I played it through twice, but there seems to be a lot of different ways to play through that. How do you prioritize content that most players will not see on a first playthrough? How do you decide which notes are more important than others when you have a massive game?
So the way we do it is we sort of use Fallout as an example. It may seem like you won't see that stuff, but we try and design it, and we're not always successful, to take into account what the core play styles are for the game. So for example, in Fallout, we make a pact with ourselves and the players that there's going to be 3 ways of playing that we always cover. And one is, hey, you're the guy with guns. You really like shooting stuff. Wow, you can accomplish quests by shooting people. And the other one is stealth. We're like, hey, you want to be the sneaky rogue guy? That's great. You can outwit guys, be clever. And then we have my favorite, the speech character, where they can talk their way through any situation and solve quests that way. Now, it may seem like you're missing a lot of content, but basically we try and make sure that's always evenly divided. So if you choose one of those 3 classes, you're going to see about 30% of how the quest arc can play out. And that's if we've done our jobs properly. And sometimes even more complicated than that. Like, okay, well, yeah, now you have to design the quest for an evil character. You have to design the quest for a good character. You have to design the quest if you're a member of NCR, if you're a member of Caesar's Legion. It's a lot to juggle, but we actually do try and balance it out almost in a spreadsheet format for how would this particular character play through the game, and are we designing it responsibly so they see the content that they would expect.
Hey, I have a question. You mentioned the grandma test and getting feedback from players. Have you ever been in an instance where you felt protective with your games and your design, and how did you overcome that, and how do you recommend, especially indie studios, to open up for feedback, especially grandma feedback?
Well, I didn't let my family members play some of my games because they wouldn't, especially Fallout. That would not go over well. They'd be like, that's what you do all day? I'm like, we didn't raise you to do that. But in terms of games that I've been protective about, I don't think I've ever been in that situation. Mostly because the first time I got some valuable focused feedback, it made me realize how important it was. And it was a really simple thing, actually. My brother was playing through the game, and he actually missed the first companion, who I didn't realize is actually a really tiny floating skull. So he's really easy to miss right at the outset because he's not automatically selected to be part of your party. So he was going through the entire first half of the game, well, not first half, but the first areas of the game, and he was missing a lot of content because his companion wasn't with him. And then I noticed that, oh my God, if we just add an auto select feature at the start, so when you wake up in the game, that guy is automatically added to your party, that fixes the entire problem. But hundreds more people could have gone through that. And I think seeing the value of that feedback always made me appreciate it, even if it may not have been communicated in the best possible way. But because at the end of the day, you just want the game to be good. I think I've exhausted your questions.
I do have another question.
Oh my God, again?
Sorry. Oh, I have to. What do you think about the way industry is moving now, like indie games, what's going on now? Because definitely it's completely different to how it was when
Well,
you
there's
started.
a lot of things I love. First off is crowdfunding. Oh man, I love that. No more going to pitch meetings where you have to sell an idea to people who don't quite get it. They kind of understand it, but they're not your passionate fan base and crowdsourcing, whether it's Kickstarter or whatever, it allows you to speak to the players that actually like the type of game that you're proposing. And often they don't want all the bells and whistles that a publisher or whoever may feel is necessary. They only want certain core things delivered, and sometimes in a much lower technology format. So that's great. The second thing is the fact that Unity exists is fantastic, because suddenly I see a lot more games coming up from a much smaller team. You don't have to have a programmer anymore to test out a cool design idea. I think that's fantastic. And the third thing that I love is digital distribution, because no longer do you have to bring in another party to sell physical copies of your game, which was back in the day, was the only way to get copies of your game sold. But now with Steam, you can put it up there, just distribute it to people digitally. That is fantastic. So those three things alone, allowing for smaller teams, more variety of games, and the fact that you can actually speak to your core audience and have a conversation about the game, I think has all been fantastic. And I think it's been a real sea change for the industry and for the better.
Hi, I have a question about the Icewind Dale games. You talked a bit about how you develop for a medium, maybe like between books and movies. And since those are like based on the D&D setting, how did you develop a setting into a game?
So for that, we did a lot of research on the whole string of books that were set in that area, because we realized a large part of that draw would be the Salvatore books. So we tried to make sure we included hooks to the actual prose itself. We actually had to make a lot of adjustments for D&D in the first place, because D&D is actually not a very computer-friendly game system. But the nice thing is the BioWare guys had already done that with Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
They were like, well, how do we turn a turn-based system into a more real-time action type game? And also, how do we implement the spell system, which is, if any of you guys aren't familiar with D&D, back in the day, second edition had this mechanic where you actually had to have a spell book and then memorize the spell, and then you only had a certain number of spells per day, which from an interface perspective is a pain in the ass to implement. And that spell mechanic's actually based on a very good, I believe, Jack Vance short story, where it works for the book, but it doesn't work in a computer game for making you feel like a wizard hero. So there was a lot of system stuff that we had to iterate on to make sure it was still fun for players. And there was actually some rules we sort of left by the wayside and recognized we just can't do these things. No, we did research a lot of the Forgotten Realms stuff. We tried to include what hooks we can. I think there were some times we included too many hooks to the book and not maybe in the best possible way. But the important thing was we wanted to make sure we were giving the feel of the Forgotten Realms. And the Wizards of the Coast guys, they were very supportive in terms of what lore we would discuss with them. And then, so we started with the books, and we're like, how do we create the feel of this environment without actually having it in the Baldur's Gate region, since that belongs to BioWare. And they're doing a great job with it, so they're fine. But
Yeah. Thank you.
sure.
So, if there aren't any more questions, we say thank you to Chris.
Sure. I